Again, like Boris, our first speaker this morning, Father Boris, I should say, I'm a bit intimidated and awed and humiliated by speaking in front of people who have been my teachers in Ukrainian studies, who've helped Ukrainianize me, who've converted me to the mission and made me a disciple. So it's a bit, again, intimidating, but I rise to the challenge as best I can. And I'm glad also that Andrei, right before me, raised the German question, because that's another perspective that I think I have something to say about, because I have been Dean of the Philosophy Faculty at Ukrainian Free University for the past few years. Again, thanks to a lot of you people here. And I couldn't have done that or taught what I'm teaching there without KUS, without Huri, without the Pinsky Institute, everyone that you've heard from now. So I have a great personal and intellectual debt to the Ukrainian diaspora more broadly, but to the institutions that you have built that have helped translate your culture and history to non-Ukrainians, even though I have some Habsburg blood maybe somewhere. I mean, Austrian blood, not Habsburg, but that's the closest I come to Galicia. And again, for me as a historian, the work of the institutes in preserving archives, in the teaching of Ukrainian language, literature, and history, and their engagement with independent Ukraine, and even pre-independent Ukraine, is something we cannot praise too much. I'd like to, I had a text prepared for this, but I've been rethinking things as I've been listening to what I've been hearing, so I'm going to try to say what I want to say, and I'll try to say it when I get there. But I want to focus on a few things. First of all, the achievements that from my point of view, of KUS and Ukrainian Studies, the new contexts and what challenges they pose for us, and then some strategies and opportunities. And we talked, Dr. Lupol from the beginning talked about power, and power has to do with strategies, and strategies for us as sort of marginal small-time players in the big pictures involves coalition building and seizing opportunities for coalition building in universities and outside the universities. So 25 years ago, the end of the Soviet Empire across Eastern Europe brought all sorts of positive moments, and I was able to take part in many of those. The biggest one being the change from isolation and Cold War ideological warfare of the past to something much more open and free and exchange and collaborative. I was involved most intimately with KUS through the Ukraine-Russia Encounters project with Frank and Zenon and Andreas Kappeler in Germany, and the Humboldt Foundation. And that did get published, and we had all sorts of dreams back then of not just getting Ukrainian historians and Russian historians to talk to each other, and Ukrainians and Russians to talk to each other, but even had fantasies about writing a collaborative Ukrainian-Russian history book on the sort of French-German model that has gone before us. So there's been a lot of progress in training a new generation of historians, anthropologists, cultural studies scholars with a focus and expertise on Ukraine. They're now getting tenure in some of their home universities. And again, as Andrei reminded us, even in Germany lately, there have been some positive developments against a generally not so positive background. And the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, another institution that was funded by the German Foreign Office, again, not a university and not a private foundation, but the German Foreign Office in the wake of Russia's war with Ukraine, and the position of Yadrina University that Andrei also mentioned, Frankfurt Oder. But again, there's the problem of replacement. There is no one been in position in a German-speaking university, and that includes Switzerland and Austria, to replace Andreas Kappeler, neither in Vienna, nor in Köln, nor in Berlin either. But one of the things, before we get on to sort of the challenges, I want to say that for me, and I think for the field of history, Ukraine has been, and again, thanks to KUS and Huri above all, has been the most important factor in what we call now the imperial turn in Russian history and East European history. Ukraine's example has forced Russian historians above all, and that's kind of the most important audience for some of us, but also Polish historians to rethink a lot of their own, at least they had for a while. And again, the Russia-Ukraine Encounters series was part of a moment of opportunity which is very lamentably lost since 2014, if not before. So I think you all have to give yourself more credit for the imperial turn, and we don't think of Russia anymore as a nation state as much as we think of it as an empire, and that includes communist Russia, communist Soviet Union, and Putin's Russia as well. It is still parting very painfully with its imperial legacy. If it will ever do that is another question. So I want to leave that achievement as the most important one for me and for historians, and by extension to those people who read history. So most Americans and Europeans now have some sense of Ukraine, but still have trouble distinguishing it from Russia, and that's a problem that I'm going to focus on a bit more. And most ominously, the shadow of Russia and its war with Ukraine, and I'm glad Rory brought that up, because I think the ethical challenges that we face now in area studies and history, teaching about Russia, teaching about Ukraine, are something that we need to talk about more and share experiences, because I think this is indeed one of the most important challenges we're facing, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So the shadow of Russia and its war with Ukraine is a constant challenge, indeed, to the very survival, not just of Ukrainian studies, but of Ukrainian state, or at least one with the borders of 1991. So Sheni Merl Ukraina has taken on a new urgency and poignancy in the face of this new existential threat. But as one colleague recently noted, one of the positive things to come out of the war, if you can find a silver lining, is Ukrainians' definitive divorce from Russian identities and loyalties, perhaps inevitable, though still very painful. And I, last year here in Edmonton, compared Austria's long codependency on Germany, the Anschluss complex, even Nazi Germany, when Austrians thought that they had to live with a powerful Germany because they didn't have enough faith in Austria to survive as an independent country. And I think the war of the last 2 years has helped Ukraine get over its Anschluss complex. And wars do have ways of shaping and creating nations and national identities. We know that from Chuck Tilley, if not a few other people. So that's one thing. But Paul Magochi said that Ukrainians are not Jews. But after my first trip to Israel, I think Israel may be Ukraine's future as a militarized democracy, and I think that's my latest thing to pour out into the monkey wrench into the works, that I think if Ukraine is going to survive as a democracy, it's going to be a militarized democracy, because Russia is not going to go away soon, just like the Arab nations around Israel are not going to go away soon, and war is not going to be something that we can forget about. Another consequence of the war has been, again, the prospect of long-term non-access to Russian archives and exchanges with Russian scholars. And given the important role of Russia in Ukraine's history, I mean, in my own case, I've been working on Pavlo Hristyuk and Alexander Shulgin from the first Ukrainian government 100 years ago. Another important anniversary that we need to think about how we can best make use of raising Ukraine's role in 1917 in the revolution that we call the Russian Revolution still. But Alexander Shulgin and Hristyuk's archives were in Prague and then ended up not just in Kiev, but in Moscow. So we're not going to get to see those archives anytime soon. And that's just one example of many cases of how there's a disruption in this. And at the same time, that historical narratives and identities, as we heard also starting with Father Boris this morning, are themselves becoming in some term weaponized, and what I'm going to try to make a case is a civilizational conflict that Russia is currently waging against Ukraine and the West, up to and including the denial of a Ukrainian nation, and with it the denial of the legitimacy of any independent Ukrainian state. And again, this is something we've known. Patricia Grimstad's work on the Museum of the Trophies of War and Empire, the archives of the Museum of Liberation Struggles, all of these things are not new to us, but they again are back in our lap. Another challenge we've heard from the beginning is the changing political economy of contemporary higher education in the West, in the United States, but not just in the West, also in Ukraine itself. Which means, above all, the nearly across-the-board decline of funding for the humanities, both in the West and Ukraine, and together with the humanities, area study centers that focus on international relations and foreign cultures and societies. Again, in Ukraine, the recent austerity measures introduced in the National Academy of Sciences have also produced similar declines in humanities education, the reform of higher education there. Humanities is being made less and less attractive, as is the teaching profession in general, all the way down to the primary school levels. And this is a crisis that's bigger than just Ukraine, but it's particularly hard-hitting in Ukraine. Again, I have several, it's hard to keep my several hats that I've been wearing lately. My immediate context is I'm the interim director of the Melikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, East European Studies at Arizona State University. And there we face many of the same challenges I think that the University of Alberta has faced and all public universities faced. And I think Arizona and Alberta probably at some point shared an unenviable place in how much public education had been cut and privatized, as together with the social welfare network of neoconservative politics. I've long contended we didn't need communism to destroy the free world. We had, in our case, the Republican Party or neoconservative party that starved public education and would very likely starve it further. Unfortunately, they have been abetted, sometimes resisted, and even less successful resisted by university presidents, provosts, and deans who have pursued short-term solutions while constantly expanding not only their missions but also their administrative staffs. And again, the biggest victim of this sort of corporate, neo-corporate, whatever you want to call it, new political economy of universities is humanities. But even the more humanistic sides of some of the social sciences, like political science that we discussed earlier. So just as we didn't need Putin to destroy Ukrainian studies, we probably because we had these sort of neoconservatives destroying the humanities more general. That leaves us with a very presentist focus, in the American case very provincial in its Americocentrism. I mentioned the Las Vegas complex. I don't know what the Canadian equivalent of a Las Vegas complex is, but the idea that we don't need to know what happens around the world, and that's reflected in the miserable coverage of the world in American media, whether it's MSNBC, Fox, or anything. You can hardly find news these days about anything but the horrible election campaign that we're enduring. A final challenge to the survival of Ukrainian studies is the continuing crisis of the Ukrainian political system and its culture and its elites' sort of half-hearted efforts to overcome decades of Soviet legacies of corruption, abuse of power, and repression. And again, Ukrainian-Russia fatigue is tied to the increasing pressure on the EU and the West to lift sanctions and further divide an already divided Europe over its own future and willingness to continue welcoming new neighbors and under what conditions. And along these lines, the sort of brain drain from Ukraine is another one of the symptoms of that, not just at the younger level. I mean, the students we teach at the Ukrainian Free University are those who've decided that Ukraine doesn't offer them an attractive future, and they want to see if they can enhance their chances by getting a German degree. But Ukrainian study centers in the West will face more and more requests for scholars from displaced institutions, like in Donetsk and Luhansk, and with not the ones just from displaced institutions or those with failing finances, or we face losing a whole generation of post-Soviet scholarship. Now to where I think we have some opportunities in all this bleakness. The function and mission of area studies and Ukrainian studies is a wonderful exemplary that has been above all about helping our fellow citizens and one another to better understand the cultures and societies of foreign countries, but also to help educate our fellow citizens about the diasporas connected to and broken off from those countries and civilizations. It has also been about translating our own cultures, and someone mentioned American studies or Canadian studies is something we should all probably think more seriously about too, helping students and scholars from our part of the world understand our own culture wherever possible in the language of our guests. We've helped our international colleagues navigate their ways through our bureaucratic Byzantine universities and communities in the first place in our nations more broadly. And that mission is more than ever vital for universities, given the mobility, some of it forced mobility of our colleagues in the regions that we study. Another area of opportunity, and again, this is thanks to Comrade Putin. As I say, he has made our cause a bit more visible than it had been for a long time. I am helping to plan a new online master's degree in global security, where the Russian war with Ukraine, unfortunately and tragically, is at the center of this new MA. And I work together with a lawyer, an international humanitarian lawyer, and a lawyer-engineer colleague named Brad Allenby, who is responsible for my use of this word civilizational conflict. We heard about hybrid war, that's what NATO calls it. The Russians call it new generation warfare, the Chinese call it unrestricted warfare, and this is what my colleague defines it as, a
It's all dimensions of a civilization in the process of long-term, intentional, coordinated conflict, one aspect of which may be or may not be conventional combat. So this includes things like sort of narratives and identities are at the center of this kind of civilizational conflict. And who does narratives and identities if not the humanities, above all? Again, literature, history, anthropology, the arts. And what he offers is what we're talking about in this sort of civilizational conflict is the creation of belief systems that can be maintained within a much larger chaotic information system by adroit manipulation of culture, psychology, beliefs, ideologies, perceptions, and opinions, religions of subgroups using appropriate levers such as comment boards, blogs, websites, and yes, even traditional print and broadcast media. And again, as we heard, I brought the article from 2 days ago, New York Times, about Maskirovka, which quotes David Glantz, who I will come back to in a minute. So one of the things that we, again, are doing, this sort of civilizational conflict is about a competition across economics, social media, propaganda, disinformation, cyber war, and again, only occasionally resorting to sort of conventional military confrontation, and usually those are special operations disguised as humanitarian missions, as we've seen more recently. But it's above all about narratives and identities, which brings us back to humanities and area studies and Ukrainian studies. And I want to, and if this image of kind of weaponizing narratives and identities sounds too militaristic, and it does for me, too geopolitically concerned, I want to leave you at least with a more upbeat version of the mission of humanities and Ukrainian studies, not in my own words, but some other persons were in the recent Chronicle of Higher Education. Humanity doesn't just exist. It has to be created over and over again. If our violent history shows anything, it is that we are not born with an innate sympathy for or understanding of all humankind. And without those, humanity is just a word. So humanity has to be built, and the only way to build it is to show young people, already rooted in their own birth culture, that they can move beyond that culture without abandoning it, that what is foreign to that culture can remain foreign and still be worthy of thought and respect. Humanists thus build humanity, one work of art at a time. In this function, the humanities are useful as individuals, useful to individuals, to be sure, but indirectly. Rather than helping an individual to a more interesting and prosperous life, they first build a shared, and let's call it humane, world in which such lives can subsequently find a place. It follows that cultures which do not teach the humanities to as many people as possible, or who adopt, for example, a narrowly nationalistic view of them, are inviting serious trouble. For continuation of the current dystopia is not the worst possibility before us. End quote. This is the kind of argument our university presidents, provosts, and deans can and should make to their governments, corporate sponsors, and other private funders, not to mention their legislatures and governors. Humanities and Ukrainian studies with a strong humanities core is a national security priority if we only expand our overly militarized understanding of what makes our nations, societies, and the world secure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Mark mentioned about imperial turn in the Russian studies, and if there is a person who contributed to this kind of imperial turn in helping to rethink what was Russian Empire, Soviet Union, among the Ukrainian historians, I would put Sergei Kelchik at the top, with his works on the 19th century Ukrainian history, but most importantly by his book on the Second World War and the representations of that war, stroke memory kind of controversy. It was important by rebuilding, reframing, rethinking Russian history. Russian history is also rethought Ukrainian history to a lot. So therefore, I'm looking very much forward to his presentation. Sergei, the floor is yours.